A very good morning and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is on permanent residency. You recall that the first part of our webinar that we held last year was on short-term residency status in Kenya. So today we are excited to hold this discussion on permanent residency. We're excited to have you with us as we dive into this discussion. This is a crucial topic for persons married to Kenyan or foreigners married to Kenyan citizens, holders of valid work permits, and also people who would generally love to know how they can pursue permanent residency status in Kenya and also citizenship. Today, I'm honored to be part of this discussion where we'll be exploring what permanent residency is, the obligations that come with it, and what categories of people qualify for permanent residency. I look forward to sharing insights and facilitating a meaningful discussion and answering your questions. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A chat box. My name is Emily Gitao. I'm an associate advocate at CM Advocates. And for this discussion, I am joined by our immigration law expert, Counsel Wahu Ambogo. Wahu Ambogo is a distinguished advocate of the High Court of Kenya and an expert in immigration law. She leads the Immigration Global and Mobility Practice Unit and CM Diaspora and Expatriates Club. With a multidisciplinary legal background, her expertise extends to diplomatic law advisory, real estate and banking, commercial and corporate law, intellectual property law, and not-for-profit law. Wahu provides comprehensive legal solutions across multiple practice areas. Welcome, Wahu, and I hope you can hear us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Emily, for that introduction.
Okay, thank you. So a brief housekeeping before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. We'll be dedicating time at the end of the session for a Q&A, and we'll try to address as many as possible. At the very end, we'll also ask you that if you would want to raise your question through audio, please ensure that you're in the right atmosphere as we are going to allow this. Now let's dive right into it, and I'd like to start by discussing what permanent residency is, and I would like Wahu to clarify what it means and how it differs with short-term residency status. Welcome, Wahu.
Thank you once again. And permanent residency status, just as the word states to be permanent, it means that it's a permanent status, which in essence is a long-term status that is normally granted to foreigners who meet the qualification, which we shall discuss as we proceed with this discussion.
All right. Wahu, maybe if you could recap our past conversation on short-term residency status and how it differs from permanent residency. What is the key difference between these two before we dive deep into permanent residency in Kenya?
Okay. If you recall, we had highlighted on the short-term immigration status, that is during our last webinar back in last year. And this short-term residence status, we primarily discussed on the residence permits and the passes. And these status are normally not permanent, and that's why we regarded them as non-permanent resident status, because they are normally subject to renewal, whereby you find that most work permits here in this country, they are normally subject to renewal for either a period of every 2 years or 3 years. That is why it is not permanent, and that is why it differs with permanent residency. And again, just to understand and to note that the status we discussed during that time is now what forms basis that will allow you to acquire the permanent resident status, which we shall continue to highlight during our discussion.
Well, thank you, Wahu. So what I'm getting from you is that one of the key differences is that the short-term residency status is subject to an obligation such as renewal, it has an expiry, and permanent residency does not have this. So one may be tempted to ask, is it similar to citizenship? Is there a difference between permanent residency and citizenship? Maybe you could shed light on that.
Okay, thank you once again. So permanent residency and citizenship are both long-term status. That is one similarity. And they are both similar to that extent that when one acquires permanent resident status, you enjoy all the equal rights with a Kenyan citizen. Say for the fact that the only key difference is that when you are a holder of permanent resident status, you cannot own like agricultural land, or you cannot participate in democratic elections or like holding state offices and such, because you are not yet a citizen. And then again, just to understand that even though it doesn't have an expiry, you still have to apply for an alien card and not a Kenyan ID or a Kenyan passport. So those are the difference, although they are almost similar to that sense that I have mentioned.
Okay, so does a permanent resident holder have to reside in Kenya upon attaining the permanent residence status?
Thank you once again, Emily, for that. So in essence, yes, after one has acquired the permanent resident status, one has to reside in the country, because in essence, the reason one is granted this status is to reside here in the country. But that doesn't mean that you can't move, you can't exit and move, going across the country, other countries for other ventures. But you have to just note that any prolonged absence out of the country, let's say that exceeds like 1 year, you need to report to the Director of Immigration in writing that during this period, you shall be out of the country.
Thank you. So what I get from you is that you have to reside in the country. However, if you're absent in the country for a prolonged period, maybe from 1 year and onwards, you have to report to the Director of Immigration. For citizens, we know they are issued with an identity card. What about the permanent residency? After all this process, which we are going to dive deep into, what happens? Are they issued with ID cards? What are they issued with?
In essence, now, when it comes to holders of permanent residents, once they are granted with permanent residence, what they hold now is this, that when one is granted with permanent resident status, the document that you have been a holder of other resident status, like a work permit or as such. And then if you are of the age of 18, it means that you have been holding an alien card or the so-called foreigner certificate. So that is the only document that you should, which is like now a foreigner ID, but you won't qualify for Kenyan ID, because in essence you are not a Kenyan citizen.